Thank you. Thank you. Good evening. It's wonderful to see so many of you here. And welcome. I'm Salman Rushdie. I'm president of Pan American Center. And welcome to the second of our state of emergency programs. This one specifically to talk about, to put it simply, torture. But just before we start, I wanted to make one small announcement about what Penn has been doing, the Penn Writers Fund has been doing about hurricane relief. In response to the hurricanes, we earmarked a certain amount of, I think it was £15,000 to assist professional writers and translators and editors, literary agents who lost lost their homes or in full or in part in the floods. And we have so far made grants to 24 writers, but of $13,000, but the need is still great. So there's a number of things you can do. First of all, if you know the whereabouts of a professional writer from the region who has been affected by either Katrina or Rita, you can please direct them to our website, to www.penn.org, where they can download an application form, or they can email, or you can email us at penn@penn.org. Or you can give us some money. There should be people around with buckets. You could make donations tonight, or you can do it through the website, again, www.penn.org. Thank you. The reason that we're here tonight, I think it's not just, we're not just here as writers and as people with consciences, but because Penn is an organization that has dealt with the subject of torture and arbitrary detention around the world in many other countries, and has become very disturbed by the fact that that subject is now a subject for the United States as well. And we feel that if we do not pursue the problem as energetically in this country, as we have done in the past elsewhere, that it enormously reduces our voice when we come to speak about these abuses in other countries. This is, amazingly, given that we planned this evening some time ago, this could not be a more topical moment to be discussing this subject. This is a really important moment in the debate over the use of torture in the United States, given that the McCain Amendment is on the table and the Bush administration is exerting enormous pressure either to get rid of it or to neuter it, but to neuter it means making an exception to the torture rules for the CIA. It seems extraordinary that an amendment proposed by a distinguished Republican outlawing the use of torture by Americans should be threatened by the Bush White House with a veto. This, remember, is a president who has never yet used the veto. It seems extraordinary that he is threatening that his first veto could be against the opposition to torture, i.e. a veto in favor of torture. It makes what we're doing all the more sharp-edged at the moment. And remember that the Pentagon has so far listed the deaths of at least 27 prisoners in American custody as confirmed or suspected criminal homicides. There has been documentation of torture and abusive treatment at Guantanamo and in Iraq and in Afghanistan and in what we now are being told are secret facilities around the world. And this includes vicious beatings, sexual degradation, sodomy, near drowning, near asphyxiation, hooding, stripping detainees naked, subjecting them to extremes of heat, cold, noise, and light, depriving them of sleep. This all falls under international conventions on torture, which say that no one shall be subjected to torture or to cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment or punishment. Those are exactly the words of the McCain Amendment, which President Bush is threatening to veto. The numbers involved are substantial. Guantanamo has 700 detainees from 44 countries, and there are maybe 400 prisoners in Afghanistan, over 7,000 in Iraq. And then arises this bizarre question of the secret gulag. It is believed that there is an old Soviet-era compound in Eastern Europe, according to the Washington Post, which has now been reused by the former enemy of the Soviet Union, the United States. There is also the question of what is now being called extraordinary rendition. Extraordinary renditions are moments in which the United States turns over suspected terrorists to nations such as Syria and Egypt, those close allies of this country, who are known to use torture as a method of interrogation. One legal opinion says, governmental authorities surrendering a person to the authorities of another state that habitually practices torture would themselves become accomplices of the crime of torture. So when President Bush says, as he has been quoted today in the newspapers as saying, that the United States does not torture, it begins to sound a little hollow when you look at the evidence that there is. And to put it simply, if the United States does not torture, what possible objection could there be to an amendment which stipulates that it will not do so? Just in case we think that we're talking this evening in the abstract, I should mention that here in the audience this evening are two men who have suffered abuse at U.S. detention facilities. You will probably hear a great deal about them and from them in the days ahead, because they are bringing an extremely courageous lawsuit against the Secretary of Defense and other high-ranking U.S. military officials. That lawsuit... Thank you. That lawsuit is part of a growing movement to end abusive practices and to uncover the full extent and human cost of this country's current detention policies, and to hold responsible those responsible for violations of this country's commitments under international law. And if you are not already involved in this effort, you can start by following the suggestions on the card that's being distributed this evening, which tells you where you can go to join your name to this matter. Now, just to let you know the format of the evening, one writer, sadly, is not with us, Grace Paley, who we very much regret is not here because she's not well. And anyone who knows Grace knows that Grace has to be really unwell in order to cancel. So we wish her the very best. Everybody is going to speak and is going to present texts which are not their own. They're going to read from other people's texts which they think to be relevant and evocative of the issues we're talking about. And we will be again, as last time, being broadcast live over WBAI and other Pacifica stations and affiliates, and also this is at this moment being streamed live at kpftx.org. So that's it. We're all going to read for a bit, and I will now get off the stage, and we're going to do it in alphabetical order, except that I get to finish, so you have to put up with me at the end. Thank you.
My name is Edward Albee. I write plays. I want to take us back a little bit at the beginning and talk about a man who was killed, murdered, in large part because he was a writer after considerable torture. There is both physical and there is psychological torture. In this case, the man was tortured psychologically and killed, literally. The country is Spain. I did my research, by the way, including going to Spain myself and finding out some stuff people didn't want me to know. The country is Spain. The time is the late part of the 1930s. The civil war in Spain is reaching its terrible climax. The fascists, under the direction of Francisco Franco and with the aid of the Germans and their forces and the help of the Spanish branch of the Catholic Church, have overthrown the legal government, the legal liberal government of Spain, and are about to take power. The slaughter has been considerable, as many civilians probably have died as soldiers on both sides. I would say that the majority of the intellectuals and creative people in Spain have left. They are mostly leftist politically, and they have gone to save their careers and indeed to save their lives. There is one man, however, who seems unwilling to leave Spain. He is a writer, and he is indeed a leftist. But he won't leave Spain for the very, very simple reason that he loves Spain very much, and he fears that if he leaves, he will never be allowed to come back. His friends, Buñuel, Salvador Dali, all of the other people who were associated with him, before they leave, they say, "You must leave. You must get out of here, for God's sake. You're leftist. You're very, very far to the left. Your writing inflames the population. Plus, you're gay. You'd better leave." But he doesn't. He stays. And instead of going to France or Italy or wherever he might have gone, he goes back home to Granada, to his family's home, on the assumption that he will be safe once again where he was safe when he was very young. Unfortunately, this is not the case. Someone betrayed him. He is arrested, and he is taken from one prison to another. His family keep following, trying to find him, and the jailers say, "You just missed him. We took him over there, 2 miles away." Finally, one dawn, he is brought out with 10 or 12 others, put in front of a firing squad, and executed. As his body is lying face down on the ground after he's been shot in his blood, a soldier comes over to him with a rifle, looks down at the body, points his rifle directly at this man's rectum, and shoots him, this dead man, once again, and says, "This is what we do to faggots in this country, isn't it?" and walks away. And so died at the age of 37, the greatest Spanish poet and playwright, Federico Garcia Lorca. If we don't learn from history, they tell us, we're bound to repeat it.
My name is Paul Auster, and I'm going to read from one of my favorite poets, George Oppen. It's from a book that he published in 1969, Of Being Numerous, which won the Pulitzer Prize. And in it, there's a long poem with many parts entitled Route, R-O-U-T-E. And this is a prose piece. It's from another time, another kind of craziness, another kind of horror, but I think applicable nevertheless. George happened to be one of the few American poets who actually saw combat in World War II. In Alsace, during the war, we found ourselves on the edge of the Battle of the Bulge. The front was inactive, but we were spread so thin that the situation was eerily precarious. We hardly knew where the next squad was, and it was not in sight, a quiet and deserted hill in front of us. We dug in near a farmhouse. Pierre Adam, though he was a journeyman mason, lived with his wife and his children in that farmhouse. During the occupations, the Germans had declared Alsace a part of Greater Germany. Therefore, they had drafted Alsatian men into the German army. Many men, learning in their own way that they were to be called, dug a hole. The word became a part of the language, faire un trou. Some men were in those holes as long as 2 and 3 years. It was necessary that someone should know where those holes were. In winter, it was impossible for a man to come out of his hole without leaving footprints in the snow. While snow was actually falling, however, a friend could come to the hole with food and other help. Pierre, whom many people trusted, knew where some 24 of those holes were. The Germans became aware that men were going into hiding and began to make reprisals. If the man was young and unmarried, they killed his parents. If the man was married, they took his wife into Germany to the army brothels, it was said. They took the children into Germany, and it was not certain whether those children would remember where they came from. Pierre told me this story. Men would come to Pierre and they would say, "I am thinking of making a hole." Pierre would say, "Yes." They would say then, "But if I do, they will kill my parents, or they will take my wife and my children." Then Pierre would say, he told me, "If you dig a hole, I will help you." He knew, of course, what he was telling me. You must try to put yourself into those times. If one thought he knew anything, it was that a man should not join the Nazi army. Pierre himself learned, shortly before the Americans arrived, that he was about to be drafted. He and his wife discussed the children. They thought of tattooing the children's names and addresses on their chests so that perhaps they could be found after the war. But they thought that perhaps the tattooing would be cut out of the children. They did not finally have to make that decision, as it turned out. But what a conversation between a man and his wife. There was an escape from that dilemma, as in a way there always is. Pierre told me of a man who, receiving the notification that he was to report to the German army, called a celebration and farewell at his home. Nothing was said at that party that was not jovial. They drank and sang. At the proper time, the host got on his bicycle and waved goodbye. The house stood at the top of a hill, and, still waving and calling farewells, he rode with great energy and as fast as he could down the hill, and at the bottom drove into a tree. It must be hard to do, probably easier in an automobile. There is, in an automobile, a considerable time during which you cannot change your mind. Riding a bicycle, since in those woods it is impossible that the tree should be a redwood, it must be necessary to continue aiming at the tree right up to the moment of impact. Undoubtedly difficult to do. And of course, the children had no father thereafter. Thank you.
I'm the most astonished to be here tonight. I come from that no man's land called the border. My name is Sandra Cisneros, and I especially want to thank Larry Seams for naming my name. I'm going to read from the Book of Embraces by the Uruguayan writer Eduardo Galeano. And I will read it first in the language he wrote it, and then I will read it in the translation by Cedric Belfridge. Los nadies. Sueñan las pulgas con comprarse un perro Y sueñan los nadies con salir de pobres, que algún mágico día llueva de pronto la buena suerte. Que llueva cántaros la buena suerte, pero la buena suerte no llueve ayer, ni hoy, ni mañana, ni nunca. Ni en lloviznita cae del cielo la buena suerte, por mucho que los nadies la llaman, y aunque les pica la mano izquierda, o se levantan con el pie derecho, o empiezan el año cambiando de escoba, los nadies, los hijos de nadie, los dueños de nada, los nadies, los ningunos, los ninguneados, corriendo la liebre, muriendo la vida, jodidos, re jodidos, que no son, aunque sean, que no hablan idiomas, sino dialectos, que no profesan religiones, sino supersticiones, que no hacen arte, sino artesanía, que no practican cultura, sino folklore, que no son seres humanos, sino recursos humanos, que no tienen cara, sino brazos, que no tienen nombre, sino número, que no figuran en la historia universal, sino en la crónica roja de la prensa local. Los nadies, que cuestan menos que la bala que los mata. The nobodies. Fleas dream of buying themselves a dog, and nobodies dream of escaping poverty. That one magical day, good luck will suddenly rain down on them, will rain down in buckets. But good luck doesn't rain down yesterday, today, tomorrow, or ever. Good luck doesn't even fall in a fine drizzle, no matter how hard the nobodies summon it, even if their left hand is tickling, or if they begin the new day with their right foot, or start the new year with a change of brooms. The nobodies. Nobody's children, owners of nothing. The nobodies, the no ones, the no-bodied, running like rabbits, dying through life, screwed every which way, who are not but could be, who don't speak languages but dialects, who don't have religions but superstitions, who don't create art but handicrafts, who don't have culture but folklore, who are not human beings but human resources, who do not have faces but arms, who do not have names but numbers, who do not appear in the history of the world but in the police blotter of the local paper, the nobodies who are not worth the bullet that kills them.
We can never underestimate the willingness of the state to act out its own massive fantasies. What about the individual? In preparing a script for their play Guantanamo, Victoria Britton and Julian Slovo collected what they call spoken evidence. Among the people who spoke to them was a British woman whose brother was arrested, possibly in Pakistan, where he was studying the Quran. She isn't sure. And then handed over to American authorities and sent to Guantanamo. Is he guilty of a serious crime, or a passport violation, or something else, or nothing at all? The power of the state is deep enough not only to shape our waking lives, but to reach into our dreams. Often we find ourselves helpless in dreams, but sometimes dreams are a form of wishful fiction, a response to helplessness, to the condition of not knowing. Here is the spoken evidence of Jeanette Belmar. We might title these remarks, Dreaming of Richard. Everyone in the family has dreams about Richard being released. It's always something positive. It's never something bad in a dream. You just wake up and you just realize it's a dream and Richard's not here. But the next day I'll say to my parents, I had this dream about Richard. And my parents, they believe in dreams. But I'm like, a dream's a dream. It means nothing. But the dream I've had of Richard, 3 dreams, and the last one where I was in this dream, and Richard wasn't in this dream, and I don't know where I am, and the sun is really shining on my face, and I'm complaining that the sun is burning my face. It's too hot. It's too hot. But there's nobody in the dream. It's just me, and the sun is just shining on my face, and I'm saying, it's too hot. It's too hot. But in the back of my mind, in the dream, I know my brother's home. So I complain it's hot, but I've got this smile on my face as well. I know my brother's home. And one day, my brother, I remember being at Heathrow Airport, and Richard was there on his own, in the dream. And when I went over to him, and he was like, I'm tired, I want to go home. And he sort of shoves me, not in an aggressive way, but he's like, I want to go home. I want to go to sleep. I'm tired. I want to go to sleep. When I have the dreams, it's always warm. So I said to my mom last week, the dream I'm having about Richard, it's always warm. It's hot. And then I think, maybe if they release him, it will be in the summer. That's what I think. I'm Don Dellilo. Thanks.
I'm Dave Eggers. I'm going to read from The Blindfold's Eye by Dianna Ortiz. Ortiz was an American nun working in a small village in Guatemala when she began to get death threats. She was suspected of aiding the guerrillas. This was 1989, a time when thousands of suspected guerrillas and dissidents were being abducted and disappeared by the Guatemalan army. The strategy of the Guatemalan government was described this way by the U.S. ambassador to Guatemala in a memo to Secretary of State James Baker. That the victims are generally unknown in wider society means a more muted reaction both locally and abroad. It makes the question why more difficult to answer and many non-political explanations. For example, common crime can plausibly be put forward to explain the victimization of a relatively anonymous person. While the victims are not figures of wide renown, they are well known within the small groups comprising the left. The bolt from the blue strike against one of their members causes a ripple of terror to go through these groups. He wasn't even the most important in our group, they might say. If they are willing to get him, no one is safe. This forces many members into hiding or exile, or at least into abandoning whatever immediate project the group had. One of Ortiz's captors, who called himself Alejandro, spoke Spanish with a distinct American accent and mentioned his ties to the American embassy. The CIA was working in Guatemala at the time, and Ortiz was certain that this Alejandro was a CIA agent orchestrating her torture and that of the others who were being held with her. Under his direction, Ortiz was raped repeatedly, burned with cigarettes, and was forced to stab a fellow detainee. This is the account of her escape. I'm curled up on the cement floor, blindfolded. The men are about to rape me again. Hey, Alejandro, come and have some fun, one of them calls. I recognize the name. They've mentioned it before. They said Alejandro was their boss. Shit, a new voice responds in perfect, unaccented American English. Then he switches to Spanish, which he speaks with a marked American accent. You idiots, leave her alone. She's a North American, and it's all over the news. Alejandro removes my blindfold. He is tall and fair-skinned. Are you an American? I ask him in English. Why do you want to know? He understands me, but insists on answering in Spanish. Bring her clothes, he calls. He helps me on with my t-shirt and sweatshirt and tells Jose to go for water. Come on, let's get out of here. Alejandro leads me down the long hallway. I'm sorry, I'm so sorry. It was a mistake, he says. You must forgive them. They had the wrong person. They thought you were Veronica Ortiz Hernandez. His hair is brown, curly, and dark, darker than his beard and his eyebrows. I begin to suspect he's wearing a wig. He has on large, dark glasses. What will happen to the other people in the building? I ask. Don't concern yourself with them. He takes me up the stairs. There are 2 landings. We go through a door and into a garage. In the garage, there is space for about 15 cars. He motions me into a gray Suzuki Jeep. It has a long, wavy, black horizontal stripe on the outside near the door. A rabbit's foot hangs from the rearview mirror. I'll take you to a friend at the U.S. Embassy who can help you leave the country. As we pull out of the garage, light dazzles my eyes. I make out a couple of open iron gates. We go through them and turn right onto a main road with large buildings. My attention is on Alejandro, whether I can trust him. He's told me to forget about the other people in the building. The torturers said he was their boss and they obeyed him. He told them to leave me alone. They did. He ordered the other men out of the room. They left. He told Jose to bring me my clothes and some water. Jose did as he was told. Alejandro knows I've seen the torturers' faces, and his face too. He's taking me to kill me. A tape of classical music is playing. It stops, and he turns it over. On his left finger, a wide gold wedding band gleams in the light. The sun is low. It's twilight or early morning, I guess. I sit forward to protect my back. My ribs, my burns are throbbing. Look, you have to forgive those guys, Dianita. They made a mistake. They didn't make a mistake. The death threats were addressed to me, not to Veronica Ortiz. We tried to warn you with the threats, he says, to prevent this, but you wouldn't leave. I stayed because I have a commitment to the people, I said. I have a commitment to the people too, he said, to liberate them from communism. Your commitment is different because you don't have respect for human life, I say. All this time I've been speaking Spanish. He's been responding in Spanish with grammar worse than mine, beginner mistakes like using a feminine article with a masculine noun. But now he switches to English. Well, you know, we have the photos of you and the videos. Those could be embarrassing. My breath stops. He is American, and the torturers have told him about what I did, what they filmed me doing. Now he's threatening me with blackmail. Does that mean he won't kill me, or will he change his mind even if I promise to keep quiet? Is he just playing with me? I look around. The traffic is picked up now. I catch sight of a sign, Zone 5. There is only one place in Guatemala with zone signs, and that's the capital. I'm in Zone 5 of Guatemala City. Up ahead is a red light. Alejandro slows, and soon we're at a dead standstill. I open my door, and I jump. Thank you.
Poem by Raúl Zurita. Zurita is a major Chilean poet. He was detained and tortured aboard a Navy ship in Valparaiso after the 1973 coup in Chile. This poem was published in 1982, and it is a work of the political imagination. It envisions a day of liberation in Chile almost a decade before General Pinochet was ousted from power. And if the people of Chile could get their democracy back after 17 years of dictatorship, we can get our democracy back too. This prophetic poem is number 9 from the series called Pastoral of Chile. I will read it first in Spanish and then in the English translation by Jack Schmidt. Ríanse a mandíbula batiente, porque ella y yo nos hemos encontrado. Gritan piedras y malezas del campo, que por nuestro amor las cárceles de las ciudades se derrumban y las rejas se deshacen, y hasta los candados han cedido, reventándose en los pórticos de los edificios. Por eso, ríanse, ríanse, que nos hemos encontrado, vuélense de amor por los pastos, que yo y ella nos queramos para siempre, y que por nuestro amor sean queridas hasta las puntas de fierro de las botas que nos golpearon, y que quienes burlándose nos decían, vánenos un poco, y nos apagaban sus cigarros en los brazos para que les bailáramos, que por nuestro amor, solo por eso, ahora bailan ellos, embellecidos como girasoles sobre el campo. Miran entonces la enverdecida de esta patria, para que sean benditos padre y hijo, esposa y esposo, para que hasta el león y la leona sean benditos, y después digan, ¿quién podrá apagar este amor? No lo apagarán, ni lo ahogarán océanos ni ríos. Roar with laughter, for she and I have found one another. Shout, fieldstones and briars, because for our love's sake the city jails are collapsing, the bars are breaking, and even the padlocks have given way, bursting in the entryways. So laugh, laugh, because we found one another. Fall head over heels in the meadows. She and I, may we love one another forever. And in the name of our love, let even the steel-toed boots that kicked us be loved. And those who, mocking us, said, do a little dance for us, and put out their cigarettes on our arms so we would dance for them for our love's sake, for that alone. Let them now dance, adorning the fields like sunflowers. Then behold this country turned green, so that father and son, wife and husband may be blessed, so that even the lion and lioness may be blessed. And then say, who can extinguish this love? Neither oceans nor rivers will extinguish or smother it.
I'm Philip Gourevitch. I'm going to read tonight the words of a Midwestern Republican to remind us all that sometimes to stand against all that we oppose most is done out of an absolutely passionate belief in the possibilities of government. Since I'm standing at the Lincoln podium tonight here, this is Abraham Lincoln's address before the Young Men's Lyceum of Springfield, Illinois, on January 27, 1838. A fairly early speech. And the backdrop was that there had been a great deal, I had to cut a lot from the speech to fit it into the time. The backdrop was that there was a great deal of vigilantism in the country. Two particularly major incidents were much in the tabloids and the papers. The lynching of a murderer, a mulatto murderer in St. Louis. And in Mississippi, a series of lynchings that began, as he put it, with the hanging of gamblers, and from gamblers to Negroes, from Negroes to white citizens, and from these to strangers, till dead men were seen literally dangling from the boughs of trees upon every roadside, and in numbers almost sufficient to rival the native Spanish moss of the country as a drapery of the forest. This is Abraham Lincoln in Springfield, Illinois. As a subject for the remarks of the evening, the perpetuation of our political institutions is selected. In the great journal of things happening under the sun, we, the American people, find ourselves in the peaceful possession of the fairest portion of the earth as regards extent of territory, fertility of soil, and salubrity of climate. We find ourselves under the government of a system of political institutions conducing more essentially to the ends of civil and religious liberty than any of which the history of former times tells us. We, when mounting the stage of existence, found ourselves the legal inheritors of these fundamental blessings. We toiled not in the acquirement or establishment of them. They are a legacy bequeathed us by a once hardy, brave, and patriotic, but now lamented and departed race of ancestors. Theirs was the task, and nobly they performed it, to possess themselves and through themselves us of this goodly land, and to uprear upon its hills and its valleys a political edifice of liberty and equal rights. 'Tis ours only to transmit these to the latest generation. How then shall we perform this task? At what point shall we expect the approach of danger? By what means shall we fortify against it? Shall we expect some transatlantic military giant to step the ocean and crush us at a blow? Never. All the armies of Europe, Asia, and Africa combined, with all the treasure of the earth, our own excepted, in their military chest, with a Bonaparte for a commander, could not by force take a drink from the Ohio or make a track on the Blue Ridge in a trial of 1,000 years. At what point, then, is the approach of danger to be expected? I answer, if it ever reach us, it must spring up amongst us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. I hope I am over-wary, but if I am not, there is, even now, something of ill omen amongst us. I mean the increasing disregard for law which pervades the country, the growing disposition to substitute the wild and furious passions in lieu of the sober judgment of courts, and worse than savage mobs for the executive ministers of justice. When men take it in their heads today to hang gamblers or burn murderers, they should recollect that in the confusion usually attending such transactions, they will be as likely to hang or burn someone who is neither a gambler nor a murderer as one who is, and that acting upon the example they set, the mob of tomorrow may and probably will hang or burn some of them by the very same mistake. But all this even is not the full extent of the evil. By such examples, by instances of the perpetrators of such acts going unpunished, the lawless in spirit are encouraged to become lawless in practice, and having been used to no restraint but dread of punishment, they thus become absolutely unrestrained. Having ever regarded government as their deadliest bane, they make a jubilee of the suspension of its operations and pray for nothing so much as its total annihilation. But it may be asked, why suppose danger to our political institutions? Have we not preserved them for more than 50 years, and why may we not for 50 times as long? We hope there is no sufficient reason. But to conclude that no danger may ever arise would itself be extremely dangerous. That our government should have been maintained in its original form from its establishment until now is not much to be wondered at. It had many props to support it through that period, which now are decayed and crumbled away. Through that period, it was felt by all to be an undecided experiment. Now, it is understood to be a successful one. Then, all that sought celebrity and fame and distinction expected to find them in the success of that experiment. Their all was staked upon it. Their destiny was inseparably linked with it. Their ambition aspired to display before an admiring world a practical demonstration of the truth of a proposition which had hitherto been considered at best no better than problematical, namely, the capability of a people to govern themselves. If they succeeded, they were to be immortalized. Their names were to be transferred to counties and cities and rivers and mountains and to be revered in song and toasted through all time. If they failed, they were to be called knaves and fools and fanatics for a fleeting hour, then to sink and be forgotten. They succeeded. The experiment is successful, and thousands have won their deathless names in making it so. But the game is caught. And I believe it is true that with the catching ends the pleasure of the chase. This field of glory is harvested, and the crop is already appropriated. But new reapers will arise, and they too will seek a field. It is to deny what the history of the world tells us is true, to suppose that men of ambition and talents will not continue to spring up amongst us. And when they do, they will as naturally seek the gratification of their ruling passion as others have so done before them. The question, then, is can that gratification be found in supporting and maintaining an edifice that has been erected by others? Most certainly it cannot. Many great and good men sufficiently qualified for any task they should undertake may ever be found, whose ambition would aspire to nothing beyond a seat in Congress, a gubernatorial, or a presidential chair. But such belong not to the family of the lion or the tribe of the eagle. What? Think you these places would satisfy an Alexander, a Caesar, or a Napoleon? Never. Towering genius disdains a beaten path. It seeks regions hitherto unexplored. It sees no distinction in adding story to story upon the monuments of fame erected to the memory of others. It denies that it is glory enough to serve under any chief. It scorns to tread in the footsteps of any predecessor, however illustrious. It thirsts and burns for distinction, and if possible, it will have it, whether at the expense of emancipating slaves or enslaving freemen. It will require the people to be united with each other, attached to the government and laws, and generally intelligent to successfully frustrate such designs. Here, then, is a probable case, highly dangerous, and such a one as could not have well existed heretofore. Passion has helped us, but can do so no more. It will be in future our enemy. Reason, cold, calculating, unimpassioned reason, must furnish all the materials for our future support and defense. Let those materials be molded into general intelligence, sound morality, and in particular a reverence for the Constitution and laws. Upon these let the proud fabric of freedom rest as the rock of its basis. And as truly has been said of the only greater institution, the gates of hell shall not prevail against it.
My name is Jessica Hagedorn. I'll be reading from a document called Exhibit D. I declare under penalty of perjury of the laws of the United States that the following is true and correct. I am a citizen of the state of Kuwait, am over 18 years of age, and have never been charged or convicted of any crime. I have been incarcerated at Guantanamo for more than 3.5 years. I have never fought against the United States, and I am totally innocent of any wrongdoing. Since August 4th, 2005, I have refused voluntarily to eat, drink, or accept medicine. After about 3 weeks, I collapsed on the floor and couldn't stand up, and they put me on an IV. At the beginning of September, guards took me to the hospital. They put me on an orange board on my back for 6 hours with my arms strapped on my side. They said, "We will put a feeding tube in you." I refused. They strapped me down on the bed and forced a tube through my nose. Twice the tube came out through my mouth. I spit blood. The doctors told me that they had a court order authorizing them to do this. My attorney informed me that there was no court order. I then confronted the doctors and told them they had lied about having a court order. After that, I tore the tubes out. The guards then came and took me from my cell to the clinic. They tied me up so that I could not move, and then forced the tubes back in me. My right foot was hurt when they did this. It is in a cast, and I need to use a walker to walk. I have continued to lose weight despite the force feeding. I have attached charts I took from the clinic showing that my weight has continued to drop and that I have gone from 200 pounds to 132 pounds. It is even lower than that now, but I no longer will stand on the scale to allow them to weigh me. Since they have been force-feeding me here, I have continuously experienced nausea, diarrhea, and vomiting. To monitor my health, a nurse comes to my cell once a week to weigh me, take my blood pressure, take a blood sample. As mentioned, I will no longer stand on the scale. This is one thing they cannot force me to do. They do force me to give a blood sample. The blood samples are taken by a nurse or corpsman, and they are inexperienced. and it is painful. At the beginning, when they force-fed me, they used a tube with a size called 12 French. Then after 2 or 3 days, they pulled it out and forced in a much larger tube with a size called 18 French. Then they would take it out after the feeding and then force it back in again before the next feeding. Sometimes they would reinsert the old tube without sterilizing it. When I complained, the doctor told me they did not have adequate medical equipment. For the last approximately 3 weeks, they have used smaller tubes, and they do not take it out after each feeding and reinsert it before the next. I understand now that it is useless for me to resist, and the guards will only tie me up and will force feed me no matter what I want. I believe that now there are between 20 and 25 people being force-fed at Guantanamo. I swear that the above is true and correct. Abdulaziz Al-Shamari, October 10th, 2005. Dear Jessica, November 7th, 2005. Mr. Al-Shamari, a teacher, went to Afghanistan in the fall of 2001 on a charitable mission. He was turned over to and then detained by the U.S. for 4 years. Mr. Al-Shamari was finally released last Friday, November 4th, and returned to Kuwait pursuant to an agreement negotiated between the governments of Kuwait and the United States. He is the father of 2 children. Our firm represents all Kuwaiti detainees at Guantanamo. Initially, this was 12 detainees, and now 6 of those have been repatriated, including Mr. Shamari. We petitioned the courts for a writ of habeas corpus on behalf of the detainees, and the name of our case is Al-Oda versus United States. A year and a half ago, our case was presented to the Supreme Court along with Rasul versus Bush. The Supreme Court held that the habeas statute does confer the right of judicial review on the detainees held at Guantanamo. They have a right to have their petitions heard by the district courts and their cases considered. However, on remand, the government again moved to dismiss, stating that although they may have a right to present a petition, they have no rights that can be enforced by the courts. Although the government lost this argument at this district court level, they appealed, and we are currently awaiting for the decision of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia. In the meantime, the detainees continue to be held without any hearing in terrible conditions, confined to tiny cells with little or no exercise, reading material, or opportunity to interact with others. In the past few months, many of the detainees have gone on hunger strikes to protest their condition, namely the lack of a fair trial, the deprivation of decent food, water, and living conditions, and the mistreatment that has characterized their stay at Guantanamo. Mr. Al-Shamari was one of those. I hope that's helpful. Let me know if you have any questions. Amanda Schaefer, Associate, Sherman and Sterling, Washington, D.C. Thank you.
My name is Heidi Julavits. It's my thinking that if Hannah Arendt had decided after the Eichmann trial to try her hand at a work of blackly comic short fiction, she might have come up with something like Donald Barthelme's "Some of us had been threatening our friend Colby." Some of us had been threatening our friend Colby for a long time because of the way he had been behaving, and now he'd gone too far, so we decided to hang him. Colby argued that just because he had gone too far, he did not deny that he had gone too far, did not mean that he should be subjected to hanging. Going too far, he said, was something everybody did sometimes. We didn't pay much attention to this argument. We asked him what sort of music he would like played at the hanging. The next item of business was the gibbet. None of us knew too much about gibbet design, but Tomas, who is an architect, said he'd look it up in old books and draw the plans. The important thing, as far as he recollected, was that the trapdoor functioned properly. He said that just roughly counting labor and materials, it shouldn't run us more than $400. Good God, Howard said. He said, what was Tomas figuring on, rosewood? No, just a good grain of pine, Tomas said. Victor asked if unpainted pine wouldn't look kind of raw, and Tomas replied that he thought it could be stained a dark walnut without too much trouble. I said that although I thought the whole thing ought to be done really well, and I also thought $400 for a gibbet on top of the expense of the drinks, invitations, musicians, and everything was a bit steep, and why didn't we just use a tree, a nice-looking oak or something? I pointed out that it was going to be a June hanging, the trees would be in glorious leaf, and that not only would a tree add a kind of natural feeling, but it was also strictly traditional, especially in the West. Then the question of the hangman came up. Paul said, do we really need a hangman? Because if we used a tree, the noose could be adjusted to the appropriate level and Colby could just jump off something, a chair or stool or something. Besides, Paul said, he very much doubted if there were any freelance hangman wandering the country now that capital punishment had been done away with absolutely temporarily, and that we'd probably have to fly one in from England or Spain or one of the South American countries. And even if we did, how would we know in advance that the man was a professional, a real hangman, and not some money-hungry amateur who might bungle the job and shame us all in front of everybody? We all agreed that Colby should just jump off something, and that a chair was not what he should jump off of, because that would look, we felt, extremely tacky. Some old kitchen chair sitting out there under our beautiful tree. Tomas, who is quite modern in outlook and not afraid of innovation, proposed that Colby be standing on a large rubber ball, 10 feet in diameter. This, he said, would afford a sufficient drop and would also roll out of the way if Colby suddenly changed his mind after jumping. Men have been known to get a little irresolute at times like that, and the 10-foot rubber ball, which could probably be fabricated rather cheaply, would ensure a bang-up production right down to the wire. At the mention of wire, Hank, who had been silent all this time, suddenly spoke up and said he wondered if it wouldn't be better if we use wire instead of rope. More efficient and, in the end, kinder to Colby, he suggested. Colby began looking a little green, and I didn't blame him, because there is something extremely distasteful in thinking about being hanged with wire instead of rope. It gives you a sort of revulsion when you think about it. So I hastily said that wire was out of the question because it would injure the tree. Cut into the branch it was tied to when Colby's full weight hit it, and that in these days of increased respect for the environment, we didn't want to do that, did we? Colby gave me a grateful look, and the meeting broke up. Everything went off very smoothly on the day of the event. The music Colby finally picked was standard stuff, and it was played very well by Howard and his boys. It didn't rain, and the event was well attended, and we didn't run out of scotch or anything. The 10-foot rubber ball had been painted a deep green and blended in well with the bucolic setting. The two things I remember best about the whole episode are the grateful look Colby gave me when I said what I said about the wire, and the fact that nobody has ever gone too far again. Thank you.
I'm Nicole Krauss. I'm going to read you something from someone called Jean Améry, who basically I came across for the first time reading W.G. Sebald. And it was a passage that I've been unable to forget since then. So I've gone back, and I'm going to read you from Améry's book, which is called At the Mind's Limits. He was someone who fought in the French resistance, was captured and tortured by the Nazis and as a political prisoner, and then ultimately discovered to be a Jew and sent to Auschwitz. This was written about 20 years after the experience. In the bunker there hung from the vaulted ceiling a chain that above ran into a roll. At its bottom end it bore a heavy, broadly curved iron hook. I was led to the instrument. The hook gripped into the shackle that held my hands together behind my back. Then I raised with the chain until I hung about a meter over the floor. In such a position, or rather, when hanging this way, with your hands behind your back, for a short time you can hold at a half oblique through muscular force. During these few minutes, when you are already expending your utmost strength, when sweat has already appeared on your forehead and lips, and you are breathing in gasps, you will not answer any questions. Accomplices, addresses, meeting places, you hardly hear it. All your life is gathered in a single limited area of the body, the shoulder joints, and it does not react, for it exhausts itself completely in the expenditure of energy. But this cannot last long, even with people who have a strong physical constitution. As for me, I had to give up rather quickly. And now there was a crackling and splintering in my shoulders that my body has not forgotten until this hour. The balls sprang from their sockets. My own body weight caused luxation. I fell into a void and now hung by my dislocated arms, which had been torn high from behind and were now twisted over my head. Torture, from Latin torcere, to twist. What visual instruction in etymology. It would be totally senseless to try and describe here the pain that was inflicted on me. Was it like a red-hot iron in my shoulders, and was another like a dull wooden stake that had been driven into the back of my head? One comparison would only stand for the other, and in the end we would be hoaxed by turn on the hopeless merry-go-round of figurative speech. The pain was what it was. Beyond that, there is nothing to say. Qualities of a feeling are as incomparable as they are indescribable. They mark the limit of the capacity of language to communicate. If someone wanted to impart his physical pain, he would be forced to inflict it and thereby become a torturer himself. It was over for a while. It still is not over. 22 years later, I am still dangling over the ground by dislocated arms. If, from the experience of torture, any knowledge at all remains that goes beyond the plain nightmarish, it is that of a great amazement and foreignness in the world that cannot be compensated by any sort of subsequent human communication. Amazed, the tortured person experienced that in this world there can be the other as absolute sovereign, and sovereignty revealed itself as a power to inflict suffering and to destroy. The dominion of the torturer over his victim has nothing in common with the power exercised on the basis of social contracts as we know it. The power of the torturer under which the tortured moans is nothing other than the triumph of the survivor over the one who is plunged from the world into agony and death. Astonishment at the existence of the other as he boundlessly asserts himself through torture, and astonishment at what one can become oneself. The tortured person never ceases to be amazed that all of those things one may, according to inclination, call his soul or his mind or his consciousness or his identity are destroyed when there is that crackling and splintering in his shoulder joints. That life is fragile is a truism he had always known, and that it can be ended, as Shakespeare says, with a little pin. But only through torture did he learn that a living person can be transformed so thoroughly into flesh, and by that, while still alive, be partly made into a prey of death. Whoever has succumbed to torture can no longer feel at home in the world. The shame of destruction cannot be erased. Trust in the world, which already collapsed in part at the first blow, but in the end, under torture, fully will not be regained.
Hi, I'm Rick Moody. I'm reading from Curzio Malaparte's memoir, The Skin, which is about American occupation of Naples at the end of the Second World War. And I stress memoir. You won't believe it after you hear this scene, but it's actually recounted in someone else's book too, so there's reason to believe it's true. In the whole of Naples, it was impossible to find a fish bone, let alone a fish. There was not a sardine, not a hogfish, not a lobster, a mullet, or a cuttlefish. There was nothing. Consequently, when General Cork gave a dinner in honor of some high Allied officer like Field Marshal Alexander, or some important politician, or some commission of American senators, he was in the habit of having the fish for his table caught in the Naples Aquarium, which, apart from that at Munich, is perhaps the most important aquarium in Europe. It followed that the fish served at General Cork's dinners were always very fresh and of a rare species. At the dinner which he had given in honor of General Eisenhower, we had eaten the famous giant octopus presented to the Naples Aquarium by Emperor William II of Germany. The celebrated Japanese fish known as dragons, a gift from the Emperor Hirohito of Japan, had been sacrificed on General Cork's table in honor of a party of senators. The enormous mouths of those monstrous fish, their yellow gills, their black and scarlet fins, which resembled the wings of a bat, their green and gold tails and their heads, bristling with prickles and crested like the helmet of Achilles, had profoundly depressed the spirits of the senators who were already preoccupied with the progress of the war against Japan. But General Cork, who in addition to his military virtues possessed the qualities of a perfect diplomat, had restored his guests' morale by intoning "Johnny Got a Zero," the famous song of the American airmen in the Pacific, and they had all sung its chorus. Thus, one by one, all the rarest and most famous fish in the aquarium had been sacrificed to General Cork's mental cruelty, including even the heroic swordfish, a gift from Mussolini, which had been served steamed with a border of boiled potatoes, and the strikingly beautiful tunny, a gift from His Majesty King Victor Emmanuel III. But one fine day, the supply of fish in the aquarium ran out. There only remained the famous siren, a very rare example of that species of sirenoids, which, because of their almost human form, gave rise to the ancient legend about the sirens, and a few wonderful stems of coral. General Cork, who had the praiseworthy habit of concerning himself personally with the smallest details, had asked the major domo what kind of fish it would be possible to catch in the aquarium for the dinner he was giving in honor of a Mrs. Flat. "There's very little left," the major domo had replied, "only a siren and a few stems of coral." "Is it a good fish, the siren?" "Excellent," the major domo had replied without batting an eyelid. "And coral?" General Cork asked. "Is it good to eat?" "No, not coral. It's a little indigestible." "Well then, no coral." "We can use it as a border," the major domo had suggested imperturbably. "That's fine." And the major domo had written on the menu, "Siren mayonnaise with a border of coral." And now, pale-faced and dumb with surprise and horror, we were all looking at that poor dead child as she lay open-eyed on the silver tray on a bed of green lettuce leaves encircled by a wreath of pink coral stems. Walking along the miserable alleys of Naples, one often catches a glimpse through the open door of some basso of a dead man lying on a bed encircled by a wreath of flowers, and it's not unusual to see the corpse of a little girl, but I have never seen the corpse of a little girl encircled by a wreath of coral. I looked at that poor boiled child, and I trembled inwardly with pity and pride. A wonderful country, Italy, I thought. What other people in the world can permit itself the luxury of offering siren mayonnaise with a border of coral to a foreign army that has destroyed and invaded its country? It was worth losing the war just to see those American officers and that proud American woman sitting pale and horror-stricken round the table of an American general on which, in a silver tray, reposed the body of a siren, a sea goddess. "Disgusting," exclaimed Mrs. Flatt, covering her eyes with her hands. "Yes, I mean, yes," stammered General Cork, pale and trembling. "Take it away, take that horrible thing away," cried Mrs. Flatt. "Why," I said, "it's an excellent fish." "But there must be some mistake. Please forgive me. There must be some mistake. Forgive me," stammered poor General Cork with a wail of distress. "I assure you it's an excellent fish," I said, "but we can't eat that. That girl, Colonel Elliot. It isn't a girl," I said, "it's a fish." "General," said Mrs. Flatt in a stern voice, "I hope you won't force me to eat that poor girl." "But it's a fish," said General Cork. "It's a first-rate fish. Malaparte says it's excellent. He knows." "I haven't come to Europe to be forced to eat human flesh by your friend," said Mrs. Flatt, her voice trembling with indignation. "Let's leave it to these barbarous Italians to eat children at dinner. I refuse. I'm an honest American woman. I won't eat Italian children." "I'm sorry, I'm terribly sorry," said General Cork, mopping his brow, which was dripping with perspiration. "But in Naples, everyone eats this species of this species of fish. Isn't it true, Malaparte, that this species of fish is excellent?" "It's an excellent fish," I replied, "and what does it matter if it looks like a child? It's a fish. In Europe, a fish doesn't have to look like a fish." "Nor in America," said General Cork, glad to find at last someone who would stick up for him. "What?" cried Mrs. Flatt. "In Europe," I said, "fish, at least, are free. No one says that a fish mustn't look like a man or a child or a woman. And this is a fish even if... Well, anyhow," I added, what did you expect to eat when you came to Italy? The corpse of Mussolini?" "Ha, ha, ha, that's very funny," roared General Cork, but his laughter was too shrill to be genuine. "Ha, ha, ha." And all the others joined in, their laughter a strangely conflicting blend of dismay, doubt, and merriment. I have never loved the Americans. I shall never love them in the way that I did that evening as I sat at that table confronted by that horrible fish. "Take it away," shouted General Cork suddenly to the major domo, pointing to the siren. "Take that thing away." "General?" "Wait a moment," said Colonel Brown, the chaplain attending the general headquarters. "We must bury that poor kid." "What?" exclaimed Mrs. Flatt. "We must bury this, said the chaplain. "Do you mean?" said General Cork. "Yes, I mean bury," said the chaplain. "But it's a fish," said General Cork. "It may be a fish," said the chaplain, "but it looks more like a little girl. Allow me to insist it's our duty to bury this little girl, this fish. We are Christians, are we not?" "I have my doubts," said Mrs. Flatt, gazing at General Cork with an expression of contempt. "Yes, I suppose," replied General Cork. "We must bury it," said Colonel Brown. "All right," said General Cork, "but where should we bury it?" "I would say throw it on the ash heap. That seems the simplest thing." "We could bury it in the garden," said the chaplain. "That's a good idea," said General Cork, his face clearing. "We can bury it in the garden." And turning to the major domo, he added, "Please go and bury this fish, in the garden." "Yes," said the major domo, bowing, and meanwhile the footman lifted the gleaming, solid silver bier on which the poor dead siren lay and put it on the stretcher. "I said bury it," said General Cork. I forbid you to eat it in the kitchen." "Yes, General," said the major domo, "but it's such a pity. It's a lovely fish." "We don't know for certain that it is a fish," said General. "I forbid you to eat it." The major domo bowed. The footman set off in the direction of the door, carrying the gleaming silver bier on the stretcher, and we all followed that strange funeral procession with our sad eyes.
In a Foreign Land by Ariel Dorfman. Came out in 2002. The poem is called Hope. The reason I'm reading this poem, it seems to me that the biggest issue that we have with terror is what our acceptance of torture has made us into. And I think that Ariel's poem talks about that. It's called Hope. It's very short. My son has been missing since May 8 of last year. They took him just for a few hours, they said, just for some routine questioning. After the car left, the car with no license plate, we couldn't find out anything else about him. But now things have changed. We heard from a compañero who just got out that 5 months later, they were torturing him in Via Grimaldi. At the end of September, they were questioning him in the Red House that once belonged to the Grimaldis. They say they recognized his voice, his screams, they say. Somebody tell me frankly, what times are these? What kind of world? What country? What I'm asking is, how can it be that a father's joy, a mother's joy, is knowing that they are still torturing their son? Which means that he was alive 5 months later, and our greatest hope will be to find out next year that they're still torturing him 8 months later. And he might, could still be alive.
Good evening. My name is Emma Reverter. I'm from Barcelona, and I'm here today to share my feelings with all of you with regard to the Guantanamo prison camp. 2 years ago, the Department of Defense invited a group of journalists to visit Guantanamo for a week. What I found there was a military base full of contrasts. Guantanamo has a golf course, a cinema, a McDonald's, and a primary school. But since early 2002, it has also been a prison for 700 men who have been denied the status of prisoner of war as granted by international law. As a lawyer and journalist, Guantanamo was a shock to me. The prisoners do not know why they have been detained, nor when they will be judged, nor if they will see their families again. They are considered enemy combatants. The truth is, we do not know if the prisoners of Guantanamo are guilty or innocent. Some could be guilty, but in any case, they have the right to a court hearing that will demonstrate their guilt or innocence. 1 week after my visit to Guantanamo, a group of the prisoners' parents came onto this very stage at Cooper Union to denounce the situation suffered by their sons. I was in the audience, as you are today. The visit of those parents to New York and my visit to Guantanamo Bay led me to write a book denouncing the legal vacuum in which more than 700 prisoners of 40 different nationalities find themselves. Tonight, 2 years later, the situation of the prisoners has not improved. Guantanamo will be written down in history as one of the darkest and saddest episodes in universal human rights. Our silence, the silence of our governments, makes us all accomplices. Let me ask you this. In the face of Guantanamo, how can we be sure that one day our families and friends will not be deprived of their rights as well? Let me share with you a poem by José Agustín Goytisolo, a Catalan poet and member of a group known as the School of Barcelona. Goytisolo's mother was a victim of the Spanish Civil War. For this reason, I would like to dedicate this poem to the victims of all wars, families, volunteers, soldiers, and journalists as well. Nadie está solo. No one is alone. Translated into English by Marianne Newman. No one is alone. At this very moment, a man is suffering. A man tortured just for his love of liberty. I do not know where he lives, what language he speaks, what his name is. But at this very moment, as your eyes read my little poem, that man exists, cries out, and you can hear him howl like a trapped animal as he bites his lips so as not to betray his friends. Can you hear him? A man alone, in shackles, cries out. He exists somewhere. Alone, I say. Don't you feel, as I do, how the pain in his body is echoed in your body? Doesn't your blood spill too with each blind stroke? No one is alone. Now, at this very moment, they are holding the two of us in shackles as well. Thank you.
My name's Martha Southgate. Before I read, I'd like to urge everyone to go beyond their presence here and take at least a small action to work against our government's current cavalier attitude towards torture. You can find information on the PEN website or at Amnesty International's website. I think even taking a small action that says "not in our name" is significant. I'd also like to take a minute to thank 3 people who helped me prepare for this evening. My friends Charles Baxter, Jessica Greenbaum, and Diana Aiton-Schenker. The poem I'm going to read was inspired by events in El Salvador, but it has terrifying resonance for us here today. It's called The Colonel, and it's in the collection The Country Between Us by Carolyn Forché. What you have heard is true. I was in his house. His wife carried a tray of coffee and sugar. His daughter filed her nails. His son went out for the night. There are daily papers, pet dogs, a pistol on the cushion beside him. The moon swung bare on its black cord over the house. On the television was a cop show. It was in English. Broken bottles were embedded in the walls around the house to scoop the kneecaps from a man's legs or cut his hands to lace. On the windows, there were gratings like those in liquor stores. We had dinner, rack of lamb, good wine. A gold bell was on the table for calling the maid. The maid brought green mangoes, salt, a type of bread. I was asked how I enjoyed the country. There was a brief commercial in Spanish. His wife took everything away. There was some talk then of how difficult it had become to govern. The parrot said hello on the terrace. The colonel told it to shut up and pushed himself from the table. My friend said to me with his eyes, "Say nothing." The colonel returned with a sack used to bring groceries home. He spilled many human ears on the table. They were like dried peach halves. There is no other way to say this. He took one of them in his hands, shook it in our faces, dropped it into a water glass. It came alive there. "I'm tired of fooling around," he said. "As for the rights of anyone, tell your people they can go fuck themselves." He swept the ears to the floor with his arm and held the last of the wine in the air. "Something for your poetry, no?" he said. Some of the ears on the floor caught this scrap of his voice. Some of the ears on the floor were pressed to the ground.
Howdy, I'm Colson Whitehead, and I'm going to read a section from Jose Saramago's Blindness. I was thinking of this book a lot the first week of September when we were getting the first images and news from New Orleans about the stadium and the convention center. And I think it also fits with tonight's topic. So, an epidemic of blindness has come across the city. The blind are being detained in a abandoned hospital. Soldiers patrol the perimeter to keep the blind from going out, and no one wants to deal with them so they don't get infected. This section is the occasion of a food drop. They haven't eaten in days, and they're about to try and get some food. And no one knows that in a couple days and weeks, both the powerful and the weak will be blind. As if it had been waiting all this time for a code word, some cue, an open sesame, the voice finally came over the loudspeaker. Attention, attention! The internees may come and collect their food, but be careful. If anyone gets too close to the gate, they will receive a preliminary warning, and unless they turn back immediately, the second warning will be a bullet. The blind internees advanced slowly, some more confident toward the right, where they thought they would find the door. The others, less sure of their ability to get their bearings, preferred to slide along the wall. In this way, there was no possibility of mistaking the way. When they reached the corner, all they had to do was follow the wall at a right angle, and there they would find the door. The hectoring voice over the loudspeaker impatiently repeated the summons. The change of tone, unmistakable even for those who had no reason to be suspicious, terrified the blind internees. One of them declared, "I'm not budging from here. What they want to do is catch us outside and then kill us all." "I'm not moving either," said another. "Nor me," chipped in a third. They were frozen to the spot, undecided. Some wanted to go, but fear was getting the better of all of them. The voice came again. "Unless within the next 3 minutes someone appears to collect the containers, we shall take them away." This threat failed to overcome their fear, only pushed it to the innermost caverns of their mind, like hunted animals that await an opportunity to attack. Each one trying to hide behind the other, the blind internees moved fearfully out onto the landing at the top of the steps. They could not see that the containers were not alongside the guide rope where they expected to find them, for they were not to know that the soldiers, out of fear of being contaminated, had refused to go anywhere near the rope which the blind internees were holding onto. The food containers were stacked up together, more or less at the spot where the doctor's wife had collected the spade earlier that day. Come forward, ordered the sergeant. In some confusion, the blind internees tried to get into a line so as to advance in an orderly fashion, but the sergeant bellowed at them, "You won't find the containers there. Let go of the rope. Let go of it. Move over to the right. Your right, fools. You don't need eyes to know which side you have on your right hand." The warning was given just in time. Some of the blind internees, who were punctilious in these matters, had interpreted the order literally. If it was on the right, logically that would mean the right of the person speaking. Therefore, they were trying to pass under the rope to go in search of the containers, which were God knows where. In different circumstances, this grotesque spectacle would have caused the most restrained spectator to burst into howls of laughter. It was too funny for words. Some of the blind internees advancing on all fours, their faces practically touching the ground as if they were pigs, one arm outstretched in midair, while others, perhaps afraid that the white space without a roof to protect them would swallow them up, clung desperately to their rope and listened attentively, expecting to hear at any moment that first exclamation of triumph once the containers were discovered. The soldiers would have liked to aim their weapons and, without compunction, shoot down those imbeciles moving before their eyes like lame crabs, waving their unsteady pincers in search of their missing leg. They knew what had been said in the barracks that morning by the regimental commander, that the problem of these blind internees could be resolved only by physically wiping out the lot of them. Those already there and those still to come, without any phony humanitarian considerations, his very words, just as one amputates a gangrenous limb in order to save the rest of the body. The rabies of a dead dog, he said, to illustrate the point, is cured by nature. For some of the soldiers, less sensitive to the beauties of figurative language, it was difficult to understand what a dog with rabies had to do with the blind. But the word of a regimental commander, once again figuratively speaking, is worth its weight in gold. No man rises to so high a rank in the army without being right in everything he thinks, says, and does. Thanks.
It falls to me to thank the 15 readers this evening. And to mention in conclusion the word Vietnam. There is a sense in which what is happening in Iraq is not like Vietnam. The Iraqis are far more divided than the Vietnamese were. In this country, there is no draft. And in Vietnam, it was American soldiers imprisoned by the North Vietnamese who were subjected to cruel, inhuman, and degrading treatment. In Iraq, the jailers are American. So there are differences, serious differences, and yet, these are 2 or 3 very short passages from Michael Herr's dispatches. The ground was always in play, always being swept. Under the ground was his, above it was ours. We had the air. We could get up in it but not disappear into it. We could run but we couldn't hide. And he could do each so well that sometimes it looked like he was doing them both at once, while our finder just went limp. All the same, one place or other it was always going on, rock around the clock. We had the days and he had the nights. You could be in the most protected space in Vietnam and still know that your safety was provisional, that early death, blindness, loss of legs, arms, or balls, major and lasting disfigurement, the whole rotten deal, could come in on the freaky fluky as easily as in the so-called expected ways. You heard so many of those stories, it was a wonder anyone was left alive to die in firefights and mortar rocket attacks. After a few weeks, when the nickel had jarred loose and dropped and I saw that everyone around me was carrying a gun, I also saw that any one of them could go off at any time, putting you where it wouldn't matter where it had been an accident or not. The roads were mined, the trails were booby-trapped, satchel charges and grenades blew up jeeps and movie theaters. The VC got work inside all the camps as shoeshine boys and laundresses and honey dippers. They'd starch your fatigues and burn your shit and then go home and mortar your area. Saigon and Cholon and Da Nang held such hostile vibes that you felt you were being dry sniped every time someone looked at you, and choppers fell out of the sky like fat, poisoned birds 100 times a day. After a while, I couldn't get on one without thinking that I must be out of my fucking mind. Sitting in Saigon was like sitting inside the folded petals of a poisonous flower, the poison history, fucked in its root no matter how far back you wanted to run your trace. Saigon was the only place left with a continuity that someone as far outside as I was could recognize. Hue and Da Nang were like remote closed societies, mute and intractable. Villages, even large ones, were fragile. A village could disappear in an afternoon, and the countryside was either blasted over cold and dead, or already back in Charles's hands. Saigon remained the repository and the arena. It breathed history, expelled it like toxin, shit, piss, and corruption. Paved swamp, hot, mushy winds that never cleaned anything away, heavy thermal seal over diesel fuel, mildew, garbage, excrement, atmosphere. A 5-block walk in that could take it out of you. You'd get back to the hotel with your head feeling like one of those chocolate apples, tap it sharply in the right spot and it falls apart in sections. Saigon, November 1967, the animals are sick with love, not much chance anymore for history to go on unself-consciously. You'd stand there nailed in your tracks sometimes, no bearings and none in sight, thinking, where the fuck am I? fallen into some unnatural east-west interface, a California corridor cut and bought and burned deep into Asia. And once we'd done it, we couldn't remember what for. It was axiomatic that it was about ideological space. We went there to bring them the choice, bringing it to them like Sherman bringing the Jubilee through Georgia, clean through it, wall to wall with pacified, indigenous, and scorched earth. In the Vietnamese sawmills, they had to change their blades every 5 minutes. Some of our lumber had gotten into some of theirs. There was such a dense concentration of American energy here, American and essentially adolescent. If that energy could have been channeled into anything more than noise, waste, and pain, it would have lighted up Indochina for 1,000 years. The mission and the motion, military arms and civilian arms, more combatant between themselves than together against the Kong, gun arms, knife arms, pencil arms, head and stomach arms, hearts and minds arms, flying arms, creeping, peeping arms, information arms as tricky as the arms of plastic man. At the bottom was the shit-faced grunt, at the top a command trinity, a blue-eyed, hero-faced general, a geriatrics emergency ambassador, and a hale, heartless CIA ambassador. All through the middle were the Vietnam War and the Vietnamese, not always exactly innocent bystanders, probably no accident that we'd found each other. If milk snakes could kill, you might compare the mission and its arms to a big intertwined ball of baby milk snakes. Mostly they were that innocent and about that conscious, and a lot, one way or the other, had some satisfaction. They believed that God was going to thank them for it. We took a huge collective nervous breakdown. It was the compression and heat of heavy contact generated out until every American in Vietnam got a taste. Vietnam was a dark room full of deadly objects. The VC were everywhere all at once like spider cancer. And instead of losing the war in little pieces over years, we lost it fast in under a week. After that, we were like the character in pop grunt mythology, dead but too dumb to lie down. Our worst dread of yellow peril became realized. We saw them dying by the thousands all over the country, yet they didn't seem depleted, let alone exhausted, as the mission was claiming by the 4th day. We took space back quickly, expensively, with total panic and close to maximum brutality. Our machine was devastating and versatile. It could do everything but stop. As one American major said in a successful attempt at attaining history, we had to destroy Ben Tre in order to save it. That's how most of the country came back under what we called control, and how it remained essentially occupied by the Viet Cong and the North until the day years later when there were none of us left there. And finally, little music. The disc jockey came on again. This one's a request for Hardcore Paul and the Fire Team, and for our groovy CO, Fred the Head. Hey, Mayhew, turn that up, turn it on up. Hey, cocksuck, you just told me to turn it off. Come on, man, that's an out-of-sight song. Mayhew turned it up. It still wasn't very loud, but it filled the bunker. It was a song that had been on the radio a lot that winter. There's something happening here. What it is ain't exactly clear. There's a man with a gun over there telling me I've got to beware. I think it's time we stopped, children. What's that sound? Everybody look what's going down. This cannot go on being a country of torturers. It's time we stopped, children. What's that sound? Thank you.